Now. In 10 seconds, they will see that.
Okay. Cool, guys. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. We will be waiting 2 to 3 minutes to get started as a courtesy to those who are still in the middle of connecting. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. We have some fascinating content for you today, but first, a few reminders. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the IM window. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter your questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/AIP recordings. While you are there, please join our community by visiting aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product design and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, requesting features, giving feedback, reviewing our product roadmaps, attending in-person events, or joining webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we will hope you'll join us. We have some exciting content for you today. This is part 1 of a 6-part webinar series on Azure Information Protection, or AIP for short. Throughout the series, we'll be walking you through all the major pillars of functionality, showing you how to deploy and configure each part. Today's introduction will cover the following topics: what is AIP and MIP, the basics of AIP, unified labeling, Office 365 Pro Plus integration, secure mail, the MCAS integration, AIP Analytics, the SDK, and Adobe integration. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Adam Bill is our resident AIP expert. He's a senior program manager on our AIP team and part of what we call our Get to Production group. The focus of this role is to help our customers deploy and configure AIP. So he's very well suited to help you with this topic. We have Avi and Raphael answering your questions that you post in the window. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to him, Adam. Adam, are you ready?
I am indeed. Thanks, Martin. Good morning, everybody. So, as Martin mentioned, this is an introduction to MIP or AIP session. Martin just touched briefly on the agenda, but what I'll do, I'll just move to the next slide where, as we touched on, there's 6 in this series of AIP. You can see the dates here. We've got both European and North American time zones, so you can pick the time zone that suits you best. If there's topics we don't drill down into today, it's because we have a session coming up on that, and I don't want to steal too much of their thunder. Also, at the same time, we're running a number of webinars for the Cloud App Security products, or MCAS. If that's a technology you're interested in, then please make sure you check those out as well. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this slide because I think I might just skip through it very quickly. Other than to say this is an introduction session, so it's like a level 100. We're going to be covering just off the basics. There won't be a lot of depth in this particular session. It's just broad. So we do have follow-up sessions that will go into a lot more detail for the specific areas. Okay, so let's level set. What do we mean by information protection? It can mean many different things depending on how we look at it. This can be as simple as a Kensington lock on your laptop. It can be encrypting data on the physical level with things like BitLocker, all the way through to rights management and turning off application controls. What we mean when we say information protection is helping you to protect that sensitive data all the way through its life cycle, inside and outside of your organization. And when we say data, what we're talking about is unstructured user data. Things like email, the different document types like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDF, whatever it is you've got. We're interested in what you as a person sat in front of that keyboard is working on. And that's the focus of this team. How do we help you understand what you've got, where it is, who's got access to it, and what they're allowed to do with it, even if that data leaves your organization? So for the context of this session and for the whole AIP webinar series, that's what we mean when we say information protection. So you may have heard about Azure Information Protection, AIP. More recently, we've sort of got a lot of information out there around MIP or Microsoft Information Protection. It can be a bit confusing, so to try and help clear that up. MIP isn't a product, it's not something you can buy. It's a framework to provide a consistent set of IP capabilities across multiple products across the Microsoft platform. We also extend this across our partner products if they choose to support it as well. And we'll touch on this as we go through, but basically it's around providing an integration that makes sense across our whole platform. Now, I don't usually talk about licensing in these presentations because, well, it's licensing and we'd rather talk about the technology. But with this convergence and unification we're talking about with AIP, there's a couple of things that are worth noting. You don't have to relabel or reprotect anything you've already done with AIP today. Okay, it's the same engine under the hood. So the labels are fine, the protection's all the same. And if you're only going to configure sensitivity labels through the Security and Compliance Center, which we'll touch on a bit later on, you never deploy the AIP add-in, and all you're interested in doing is classifying and protecting Office documents only, then once we release that native integration into Office, you'll be able to perform these under an M365 E3 license. And there's some details on here as well. Anything beyond that, will require what we call an AIP P1, which is for manual classification, or an AIP P2 for automatic. And these are typically found in EMS E3 and E5. Okay, enough of the licensing talk. So as this is an introduction session, and it's possible we have people on the session that have never even looked at AIP before, I just want to take a few minutes and look at some of the basics of how AIP works. From a client's perspective, this is what they would generally see. We've got the AIP, which is an add-in to Office today. We get the toolbar across, and that's present in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. You also get the Protect padlock in the ribbon, and you can see in my little inset picture there that if you click on the Protect, you get a drop down and you can see the same labels that are present in the toolbar as well. So there's a couple of ways you can serve this up to your end users. We also have this concept of parent labels or top level labels and sub labels. So as you can see across my toolbar, I've got non-business, public, general. These are my top level labels. And you can see a little black triangle on the side there. That indicates that I've got sub labels. Typically, sub labels tend to be used when we're talking about protection, and we want to handle content differently. So I won't touch on that too much today. So that's what the client sees. If we look at the back end today in the Azure Information Protection portal in Azure, you can see here under my label configuration that I've got those labels that we just saw on the client side. You can see a nice little indicator in the table whether they include visual markings, which is a header, a footer, or a watermark. And you can also see if they've been configured to apply protection. We can edit labels and we can configure them from here. And we can set things like whether there's visual markings, whether we want automatic conditions, so that if I have a document that has, say, 3 credit card numbers in it, then I want to apply this label. Now, once we've got those labels, we need to put them in a policy so that that's applied to our users. We have a default policy, which is called global, and this is the policy that all users see when they're using AIP. We also have the concept of scoped policies. These allow us to provide a specific label to a small group of people, and only they see that label in the toolbar. If that label has protection configured, only those users or the groups configured have access to the content that's protected by those documents as well. We tend to find that scope policies are used by departments like HR, legal, mergers and acquisitions, senior leadership, those kind of groups. And when we apply a label, in essence, what we're doing is we're writing metadata into the document. So we're writing in this metadata that explains what the label is. If that document is protected, that metadata is still visible in clear text. What that means is we can use our DLP or our CASB solutions to examine that content, or at least the metadata as it's traversing our infrastructure, and we can still make decisions on whether we will allow or deny that content to go outside our organization. So that's the basics covered. If we look at historically, if you've been in IT for a while, this will be a fairly familiar picture. Traditionally, we had users would come to work, they'd sit at their desk, they'd create content. And from a security perspective, we just pretty much had to worry about the perimeter. We worried about our ingress and egress points. And if we had those covered, we felt pretty comfortable. Unfortunately, that's not really where we are today. And what we find is this is our reality. Users want to work at home, they want to work on the train, in the hotel. They're not just sitting at a desk anymore, they're working on multiple devices, they want to be on their laptop, their desktop, their phone. And with the ease of signing up for SaaS applications and a company card, whether your organization is prepared for it or not, your data is traveling. And this presents as a real challenge. So when we talk about Microsoft Information Protection Solutions, this is our vision slide. Everything we've been working on aligns to this slide in some way. So across the top, we've got our 4 main pillars, our life cycle of data. We've got discover, so we need to understand where our data is. We've got classify. Once we understand where our data is, we want to classify it. Not all data is the same. So we want to apply one of those labels so we can understand the data we've got out there, the really sensitive stuff that really is critical if it gets into competitors' hands or outside the organization, you're in a whole world of pain. We need to understand that small percentage of data, typically 5 to 15%. We want to be able to protect that data to ensure that only the right people have access. And across all of this, we want to monitor. We want to know what label usage is, whether people are declassifying data in bulk. So we want to monitor the situation. And this isn't just a Windows world. So this can't just be on a Windows device. It needs to be on Android, iOS, Mac, any device that the user's working on, whether they be on-premise or working in the cloud. That's where we need to have capability. And this is what we're working towards around convergence. So by convergence, we mean that today there's lots of different ways to apply information protection across the Microsoft 365 platform. And we're trying to make this more consistent for the admin experience. We're trying to make it a consistent level of protection across the platform. And we're trying to ensure that it's simple and easy to use for end users. So just looking at these three scenarios, we've got Office information protection. We've got a number of places where we need to configure all these capabilities. And it applies to a very specific set. So with Windows Information Protection, which is available in Windows 10, we can protect files and documents. It's configured on the endpoint, but it has to be configured in the Intune portal. And then we've got Azure Information Protection. From an admin's perspective, this is really quite complex, and we need to make this easier. So some of the things we're working on is to streamline all of this, provide a central portal. So we're looking at the Security and Compliance Center because that's where our security professionals are generally working. And we're trying to make sure that it works across all those locations we had in the previous slide. If we extrapolate this out even further, we've got all these different capabilities, which is great. We're very good at providing capabilities, but this can be really complex and confusing to implement. So again, as part of our convergence strategy, we're trying to simplify this and standardize it across the platform. The aim is to make it simpler to manage and enable you to be more effective in managing information protection. This isn't something we can deliver in a single delivery. It's going to be multiple jobs, but this is the roadmap. This is what we're working towards. So when we talk about Microsoft Information Protection, or MIP, this is our MIP on a page. We won't go through all of these today. There's a lot of content in here, but this is a simple summary of the main MIP integration points we have. We will touch on a couple of these as we work through, and we do have some sessions that will drill specifically into some of these later on in the next few weeks. One of the areas I like to call out, actually, while we're here, is conditional access. So our customers aren't aware that AIP is one of those applications supported by conditional access. So here we can configure any of the standard options supported by CA today, and we can define how users consume that protected content. Now this could be we enable MFA or a managed device, or you must be on an IP network that falls in the corporate range. But this applies to all protected content, but it gives us that capability that even once that protected content moves beyond our traditional boundaries, we've still got ways of ensuring we have control over that. Now today this applies for regardless of what label has protection, it's all protection, but we are currently planning to expand this to be per label conditional access. So this will give us a lot more granular control. Okay, referring back to that earlier slide, that was pretty scary. In this slide, we start to have a look at what products we have that we can apply to get some control back on this picture. So if we're looking on the on-premise side of things, we've got the AIP scanner to help us scan that data at rest. And that gives us capability across file shares and SharePoint on-prem. And we have a session that covers this in more detail later, but we've got that kind of covered. We start looking at devices on our endpoint. We've got the AIP plugin in Windows Apps today, which is going native shortly, which we'll touch on more in a little while. We've also got that integration with Windows Information Protection. So with WIP, things are very black and white. It's either personal data or business data. And as of the more recent delivery of Windows 10, so 1809, we've enlightened WIP to understand an AIP label. So now what can happen is an AIP document can be downloaded to a client device running the latest version of Windows 10, and WIP can make decisions based on where that data or content should or should not go. And then across the cloud and SaaS app space, we've got Office 365 DLP, and we've got Microsoft Cloud App Security, which gives us capabilities in that area. So that scary picture is not looking quite as scary anymore. We've got controls that can help us bring this back under our view. So one of the things we've been working on is what we call unification. And in this, we're talking about moving the AIP label management from the Azure Information Protection portal, so it's another portal we have to worry about as security people, into the Security and Compliance Center. So here we can see a screenshot of SEC today. This is my demo tenant, and you can see here these are the same labels that we saw when we were looking through the AIP basics before that showed you in the AIP portal. Now, if you're already using AIP today, then you'd want to migrate those labels. And in essence, migrate's a terrible word. What we're doing is we're copying the labels you have out of the portal and we're copying them over here. But importantly, within those labels, there's a unique identifier and we're copying that as well. This means you get a consistent experience for those labels in the AIP portal, but also in SEC. All of our new configurations, so we're talking about Office for Mac or Android, iOS, even our Adobe integration, which we'll touch on a bit later on. All of these new capabilities will look to the SEC for their labels, and the configuration is also stored here as well. It's just something to be worth bearing in mind. So you may have heard us talk previously about Office 365 integration, or going native as we call it. And the premise behind this is about today, AIP is a .NET add-in. There's some performance impacts to that. There's the fact that you have to deploy this to every machine that you want to use AIP on. Part of going native, we're basically saying that the AIP add-in, the code from that will be added to the Office code base. So we're natively built into the product. This is only going to apply to the Pro Plus version of Office. So that's the subscription version you get with Office 365. If you're on the perpetual versions, so Office 2016, even the upcoming Office 2019, or any of the other downstream Office clients, you'll need to deploy the AIP plugin. The functionality as we go native will be released in steps. So the first step is to support manual classification, and it sort of at a period of time over the rest of this year, we will continue to expand on that capability. The advantages we get of putting out code base native into the Office app is of course that we're built in, so there's nothing to deploy. We get a performance increase from that, but we can also leverage Office's cross-platform story. So we're no longer bound just to being on Windows. We can look at Android, iOS, Mac, and we've got these released on those platforms today. Also, staying current becomes a much easier perspective. You don't have to worry about rolling out an AIP plugin, even though we release it through Windows Update and you can patch using your normal patching mechanisms. We build this into the Office product so it gets updated during the normal Office update cycles. So if we look at some of these screenshots across the different products, you can see that we're looking at being consistent. Unfortunately, when we talk about cross-platform, we're also talking about different device form factors. So we're talking about mobiles and tablets and laptops, and some of these are fairly small on the screen real estate. So we're unable to put a toolbar in there because it just doesn't fit with some of those form factors. But here you can see Word on Mac. It's pretty consistent. Down in the status bar on the bottom there, we can see the label is highly confidential. And in this instance, we've got a padlock, which means it's protected. Moving on, we can see Outlook for Mac, same sort of concept. We've got our drop-down labels. In this instance, public's been selected and it's nice and visible across the top of that email. And looking in the reading pane, we can see there in the preview that it's nice and visible as well. So it's not buried, it's clearly visible to our end users. Word on an iPad, it's the same experience. It's not going to freak out our users. We're providing that consistent UI. If you select a label that has highly confidential, you can see here the watermarkings and the header, just as if you'd applied it on Windows. And lastly, we've got Word on Android. So we can see here, it's a consistent experience. So here we have what we refer to as the AIP for unified labeling. So this is our add-in for the next version of AIP. So where it's pulling that policy from the Security and Compliance Center. Here, there is a toolbar. So this is something some of our customers feel strong about, but it's only present on the Windows version because, largely that's going to be desktops and laptops. It's configurable, so you don't have to have the toolbar there if you want to maintain consistency for your customers that are running native. And this is actually in preview today. So we've got this available. You can download it and have a look where this will pull the policy from the Security and Compliance Center rather than the AIP portal. One thing to bear in mind with this is it is a complete rewrite from the ground up. Okay, so where the technology is not new, the actual plugin is in this instance. So we're expecting there might be a few bugs in the early releases. So definitely need to be testing this out early. When we talk about information protection, one of my favorite topics is Office message encryption. Now with OME, we have the ability to send an email to pretty much anybody that has an email address. Now, if they're an Office 365 user and they're running Office Pro Plus, quite obviously, we've got control over both sides of the conversation there. We can make that what we call a high fidelity experience. The email will render inline in the user's mailbox. They'll get a tooltip telling them that this was protected in confidential, and it will render. If you're not on Office 365, and let's face it, a lot of our customers are not, you still have the ability to send an email to them. Now we have this concept of federated users. So that's if they're Google, Yahoo, or a Microsoft account, they can receive this wrapper email that lets them know that they've got a protected content sent from me, Adam Bell at Microsoft.com. They click on the read this email now, and they get redirected to the OME portal. In fact, let's just show that screen there. Now you can brand this so that it looks like it's come from your organization. They're redirected to the portal. They log on using their own credentials, and we will web render the email. And if we can, we'll web render the content as well, the attachments. Now, if they're not a federated user or an Office 365 user, we have a third category. What happens here is when you go to log on, you can request a one-time password. We send a code to the same inbox, and then you can log into that web portal and you can web render that email. And if we can, we'll render the attachment as well. So this is the same protection technology under the hood that we use in AIP, and it's really useful in our external collaboration scenarios. One of the features we released at Ignite last year was now we surfaced some of the reporting around OME into the Security and Compliance Center. So you can start to get some insight into what templates are being used with OME and how prevalent it's being used across your organization. Just want to quickly talk about Microsoft Cloud App integration. Now, as I mentioned before, MCAS has its own webinar series ongoing, but we have some particularly good integrations with AIP. So we have the ability to scan using AIP Scanner on-prem, which I'll touch on briefly in a few slides' time, but we deliberately didn't put any capability into our scanner to scan SharePoint Online, for example. And the reason for this is we've got this capability and more already built into Cloud App Security. So we decided to put our investments from AIP when it comes to cloud into MCAS. So here you can see a screenshot of a file policy. And today you still need to specify the conditions you're looking for. So you need to say, I'm looking for if I see 3 credit cards or any of the built-in types or string matches that you're looking for within that content. Now, our North Star, where we're heading to on this, is that you'll just have to enable the AIP integration MCAS, and then MCAS will leverage all the configuration you've already configured, but we're not quite there yet. What we do have today is the ability to, once we find that condition we're looking for, to set AIP as an outcome. So we can specify a label and say, if I find 3 credit card numbers in a document in my corporate box account, then apply this label. And if this label happens to have protection enabled, it will actually encrypt that file in that service, provided you've connected it to MCAS. So this gives us a capability well beyond our normal boundary into something that's not on the Microsoft stack. It's in corporate box account, but we can still manage it. And this is just showing an example of the little V2 in a box, just means that we've encrypted the file in place there. We can also look at files that we have identified there, and we can see some details on them. We can also run reports that say, across my box account, show me all the files out there that I have as highly confidential. So we can also get insight into these cloud services for our classified and protected, or not even necessarily protected, but potentially protected content as well. So we can get insights into that. So I will touch just briefly on monitoring side of things, or AIP reporting, or AIP analytics. There is a session for this later on in this series, so I don't want to steal their thunder too much. But up until now, if you wanted to monitor what was happening, whether people chose to downgrade labels or justified changing a label on the endpoint, we stored this inside the event logs, which meant from an admin point of view, you had to harvest all of those using Windows Events Forwarding or Ops Manager or some other tool, and then you had to perform your own analysis. So it wasn't a great outcome. We're in the process of in preview at the moment, AIP Analytics, If you've deployed a version of the client from December last year onwards, you have the capability to send your logs centrally into what was called the Azure Log Analytics, which is now Azure Monitor. That gets you all your logs central from the client side of things. And we've got some dashboards available to give you insights into what that data looks like. As I say, there's a number of these. This will be drilled into in another session. Just the points worth calling out is you have the data centrally. There's 5 gig of storage for free in the free tier, which gives you approximately 8,000 endpoints, depending on the data you're collecting from an AIP, and 30 days retention. You can select a paid for tier, which gives you more data in both directions, both retention and gigs. But what we've got here is the ability to start looking at our data. And if you don't like our queries, you can edit them and change them. You can also write your own. The data is all central at that point, so it's yours to manipulate as you see fit. Here you can see an example of the activity logs, which is really great. It gives us that insight into what's going on with the classification side of things. Now we can chase this through for a file or a specific user or an endpoint, and we can start to understand from an information protection perspective what's occurring on that device. Some of our customers aren't aware, but we have the software development kit or SDK. So we have a session on this coming up on April 16th for Europe and April 18th for North America. But just in essence, I'll give a quick summary here. All the capabilities that we're building ourselves internally at Microsoft, so we're talking about MCAS and Office Native, these are all built on top of our SDK. We make this SDK available to our customers and our independent software vendors as well. So this is really important because it provides the same capabilities we have today across Discover, Classify, Protect, and Monitor to be added to their products as well. Or if you've got an important line of business application internally in your environment, you can also add it to your applications too. So here you can see that the SDK is built in cross-platform C++, so it's performance, it's not bound to a single platform. You can use this across Mac, Linux, Windows, Android, and iOS. This gives both our vendors and our customers the ability to extend this information protection capability into their products as well. We've got a link there that drops you onto the MIP SDK homepage. If that's of interest of you, I encourage you to go check that out. So one of the really good announcements we had recently was Adobe's support for AIP natively within their products. So we've been working with Adobe for quite a while now, and this came off the back of customers going to Adobe and saying, hey, we're doing this work with information protection. The PDFs are a really important document format to us. We really need some support in this space. And Adobe have gone, yep, cool, no problem. So we've been working with Microsoft and Adobe for the last, I think, 2 years. Adobe have actually updated their PDF document format to help support this. So it's gone to RMV2. What this means is if you have Adobe Reader today, there's a plugin to install, but you can open protected PDFs within Adobe Reader. You can see the label that's been applied within PDF documents as well. Now, it's on the roadmap for Adobe to release updated versions of their products throughout the course of this year and beyond, where they will have that capability built in. You won't need that add-in. So we've talked a lot around what is AIP, the mechanics of it, some of the solutions we're trying to help you out with. I just want to spend a brief period of time talking about, well, that's great, but how do I get started with this thing? It seems really simple on the surface, but when you start digging into it, AIP touches a lot of different areas. It can be quite complex. So how do I get started with this thing? So as Martin mentioned earlier, we've got the AIP CXE team. Our role is working with our largest enterprise customers, helping them to deploy AIP. We share best practice, we share what's been successful with other customers, and we generally help to increase the speed of the deployment and avoid some of the common pitfalls. Well, that's great for our large enterprise customers, but we have a lot of customers out there. We're only a small team. There's only 10 of us globally. There's only so many customers we can work with. So to try and help with this, we've written the Deployment Acceleration Guide. Okay, this is published on ak.ms/AIPDAG, And in this document, we've tried to distill kind of our knowledge, if you like. We've tried to share the best practices that we've found when deploying with these customers so that a much broader base of customers and partners can use this and avoid making some of those common mistakes. So if we look just holistically at getting started, classification doesn't break anything. A lot of the challenges come with protection, and that's why we have a dedicated protection session coming up where we'll drill into the things to consider around that. But to start with, you need a taxonomy. You need to have a set of labels that make sense for your organization. And we have a session on that. But just briefly, if you don't have a taxonomy internally already that's been documented and driven by your security team, Microsoft has a default set of labels that are available when you enable AIP. Now, these aren't just something we've thrown together. There's been a lot of research based on these labels and they make sense. So if you don't have something driving you as a requirement, it's well worth looking at those as a starting point. You also need to then look at getting the AIP agent out there if you're looking predominantly on Windows today, or consider native when we preview that later on this year. But you need to customize those policies so that you can look at the areas that are most important for you. So this talks about protection, but protection really is something that needs to come a bit later. And you need to start classifying that data. So get the end users trained, get them understanding what you're expecting of them and the plugin, and you can start classifying new data. But in parallel, it's definitely worth looking at the scanner to see about scanning that data at rest so that you can look at both sides of your information protection. And this isn't something you just turn on and enable overnight and then walk away from. It is a bit of a journey. It's a complex conversation. You need to define your timelines. You need to look at what's important to you, and then you need to keep reassessing that you're being successful and then implement the next set of features as appropriate. So we have some resources available here. I'm sure as part of the recording, the deck will be available as well. So I won't link it too much on this, except for to say the AIP documentation. We've got Carol Bailey, who's our document writer. She works tirelessly to ensure that everything that should be in the documentation is, and that it's accurate and that it's current. So if you have any questions around the AIP, definitely go check out the docs as your first point of call. And from a deck perspective, that's the main thing we had for the session today. If there's any questions, I'm sure we can do a bit of Q&A at this point.
Adam, there were a couple of questions coming regarding the migration from AIP to MIP, the labels. If you can touch on this point, because I think it needs to be clarified a bit.
Absolutely, and thanks, Avi. That's a great topic. So this is an area where we do have a bit of confusion with some of our customers. It's a short-term pain point as we progress through the rest of this year and we move the labeling from the AIP portal to being only in SEC. So this isn't something that's going to drag on forever. But basically, if you've deployed the AIP plugin today, or if you're about to deploy, don't stop. Obviously continue with that. Though, for simplicity's sake, let's refer to that as AIP v1. So the AIP v1 plugin today talks to the Azure Information Protection portal for its settings. So that's where you need to configure labels. That's where you need to configure your policies. And the add-in for Office on Windows, that's where it will go and you can label and classify. If you're starting to look at Office for Mac or Android or iOS or the Adobe integration we just touched on, all of these new capabilities will look to the Security Compliance Center for the labels and their settings. So we have a button inside the Azure Information Protection portal that will enable you to migrate your labels. It's really quite straightforward. You click on the migrate button, 2 to 10 minutes, it will copy your labels to the Security and Compliance Center. As I mentioned before, the reason we want to copy them rather than you just recreate them manually in SEC is A, you may have a lot of labels, but also inside the label, we have a unique identifier. So if you do have clients on Windows today with the AIP plugin, and you wanted to say, look at Office for Mac, you want to make sure that we've got the same label across both those platforms. So by migrating those labels, we ensure that consistency. Now, it doesn't migrate settings. Okay, today the migration process only migrates the labels, But it's important to note that once we do that migration, we also set up in the background a synchronization between the Security and Compliance Center and the AIP portal. So if you do the migration and then you create a label in SCC the following day, that label will be synchronized back to the AIP portal. Any policy settings will not. So that's something in the short term you'll need to manage in both locations, both in SCC and the AIP portal. Hopefully that covers off the questions in that area. If you're just moving straight to, say, Office for Mac and you're not looking at Windows right now, then you could potentially just go straight to SCC. But depending on what your timelines are and what you're thinking about deploying from the AIP side of things, you're probably going to want to configure everything in the AIP portal to start with, and then migrate those settings to SCC so you've got them in both places and you've got that continuity across all platforms. Do we have any other burning topics? Anything we can discuss?
Adam, we are going through some of the available questions on the window right now, the Q&A chat window. So we'll keep answering those.
Yeah. Another question that that came up here and maybe also need clarification is as we are going to the SCC, we have the sensitivity labels and the retention labels, and if you can clarify the difference between them.
Yep, absolutely. So hopefully my screen loads shortly and you can see the Security and Compliance Center. And as Avi just mentioned, we have two tabs across the top. We have sensitivity labels and we have retention labels. The main view here, at least from my perspective, and obviously it's going to be skewed because I'm into information protection, is sensitivity labels refer to what we'd call today our information protection labels. They are persistent. That metadata we talked about is written to the document. It travels everywhere the document goes. We talk about retention labels. This is an area I'm not particularly strong on, so I'll only give a summary here. But in essence, this applies to how long the data should be retained before we take an action, whether we delete it or whether we archive it and make it a record. This applies to the file as long as the file resides within the Office 365 platform. So if you're in SharePoint Online, you're in OneDrive, if you move a file to your laptop, the retention label doesn't persist with it. And we did look at whether we could make retention an attribute of sensitivity. But when we talked to a lot of our customers to assess this, we found that they may have 20 AIP labels, but they might have 50 to 70, 100 retention policies. So it wasn't really going to scale. So it's made sense to keep them separate. Hope that helps answer that question.
Another question that we have here and might be of interest to the general audience is about the difference between the client and the native implementation, and how the features will be spread across them, like the Explorer right-click, context menu support, and PowerShell, and what will you need to install on the machine?
Excellent. That's a good question. So around the native side of things, the roadmap is to have what we call feature parity, so that everything built natively into Office will be the same as we have in the AIP plugin today, that we have visible within Office. So if we talk about the right-click context sensitive menu and being able to classify and protect, and the PowerShell side of things, these won't be native within the Office product. So the classify and protect and the PowerShell commands, you will still need to deploy the AIP add-in for those features. And I guess while we're talking about native, it's also worth being aware that once native does become available, if you're using the Pro Plus version of Office and you have the AIP plugin deployed, the default behavior is for Office to disable the plugin today. Now, if that's not something you want to do, because obviously the plugin has more capabilities than Office Native will initially, there is a group policy setting you can set that will override that behavior and ensure that the AIP plugin is not disabled. So the control is with you. You can decide when it's appropriate to cut over to native once we have that feature available.
I see, Adam, I also see a bunch of questions about the support within the Office, different versions, like the MSA versus Pro Plus, Click to Run. If you can also clear this subject out.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, like if someone needs the support native in Office, like which versions of Office it will come. Office, like if it will be included also in the MSA versions of Office or only in the Click to Run versions, and how to manage this.
Okay, cool. So when you said MSA, I thought you might be referring to Microsoft accounts.
I know.
So specifically around native, the Office product group, not even just around the AIP capabilities, but the Office product group today are focusing all their engineering effort of new features only into the Pro Plus version of Office. So we've got Office 2019 coming, which is the upcoming perpetual version. This is a snapshot of the Pro Plus, I think, from partway through last year. But all the new features will only go into Pro Plus. For all the other versions of Office, whether it be Office 2013, 16, and 19, these will get obviously security hotfixes, but not necessarily new features and or bug fixes. So as an example, we had a situation where if you protected a Word document and you wanted to use track changes, you had to have full control. So you couldn't have lesser permissions, it wouldn't work for you. That was obviously a bug. A lot of our customers pressed us to fix this. The Office PG fixed this last year, but they only fixed it in the Pro Plus version of Office. For everything else, if you happen to be on a different version of Office, that's where you would use the add-in, the Office add-in, sorry, the AIP add-in, as we do today.
We have one interesting question regarding whether PDF Acrobat would support sublabels. Can you explain something about that, please?
That's a really good question. It's not something I personally have played with. Do one of you guys have a view on that?
Adam, we are still going through the questions, but I don't understand. I don't really understand the question about Adobe. You can apply a sublabel to an Adobe file right now.
Excellent. So that should be the answer then.
In other words, you can apply a sublabel, and the sublabel would also be visible when you open that protected file in Adobe Acrobat Reader. So that basically answers the questions as yes, it's supported.
Regarding the visibility is an implementation of Adobe, and I don't know if it shows it. I don't know if it's a bug. There is a prerequisite for this for you to migrate to SCC, to the SCC, and apply a registry key to enable the displaying of labels within Adobe. And you can find there is a blog post in the Azure Information Protection blog referring to how to configure the integration with the Adobe client. It should show there, and if not, and I'll test it after this and I'll see, but it should be supported as far as I know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, when I last looked at that was a few months ago. By default, Adobe was only displaying if it was protected, but there was a registry key you could configure for classified only content to display in the toolbar for them. Actually, I've managed to get the questions up as well, and I can see one here saying, please provide some links to a virtual lab to learn AIP. I'm not convinced that we have a lab available except for at events. I'll let one of the guys correct me if that's wrong. But one of the easiest things to do, I found when I was playing around with AIP, is to get an Office 365 trial and with the EMS trial, and just have a play. You get a number of days where you don't have to pay for this. You can configure the labels, you can spin up a virtual machine, and you can pretty much do it all with trial software, I guess what I'm trying to say. So whereas there isn't a specific lab, we do have a lab manual, actually, which you can follow the steps. Let me just see if I've got the link.
I have it, I'm posting it.
Excellent. Yeah, if you post the link to the manual, that will certainly help.
Can we take any famous last questions? And then before we conclude the call?
If that was a question to me, then absolutely. Yes. One of the things I will add for the attendees is if we don't answer all of your questions today, we do get a transcript of them all at the end of the session. We'll make an effort to work through them and we'll post them up on the Tech Community site so that the answers, if they're not answered today, we will get an answer to you shortly.
There's one interesting question. What happens if I send as an attachment a confidential labeled Word document to an external user who should not be enabled to view it? So you should not be allowed to view it. I tried doing so to a Gmail account and received an opening a doc file generic error. And I think that's a pretty interesting question. We're working separately on something like that. And maybe Adam, you want to comment a bit on that, on the behavior with sending out confidential labeled protected Word documents to somebody.
Absolutely. So it is one of the more complicated conversations to look at when we start looking at protection. So internal protection is fairly straightforward. It's within your control. You can ensure that we can minimize the challenges there. When we start talking about external collaboration, in this instance, actually, if you're talking about a document that's protected with a label, and let's say highly confidential, and if the permissions on that are, let's just say Microsoft internal, and I send that to my Gmail account, then absolutely I shouldn't be able to access that. Not so clear on the error. If you send it to someone who's even another Office 365 user, at the end of the day, AIP protection uses the right management service. If you're not on the permissions list, you don't get access. You'll get prompted to provide credentials and you'll be told that you don't have permissions to access this file. If we're talking about how do we send content out externally and so it can be consumed, there's a lot of variables and there's a few ways you can approach this. The simplest way is using Office message encryption we talked about earlier, OME. If you could apply a Word document that isn't protected to OME, and then you can select do not forward or encrypt only to send that out, even if it's going to a Gmail user or those consumers we talked about before, we can generally provide a good experience there. There are some edge cases where that can be a bit more challenging. As long as we're using a label-based protection, however, the expectation is they should be able to at least web render that content if we can. Where it becomes a bit more challenging is if you're trying to apply do not forward. So you're, an example is I'm sending you my data. I care what happens to it once you receive it, and I'm trying to apply control over that about who has access afterwards. Then that can be quite challenging with consumer identities today, and there's a few caveats around that.
Thank you. Any last question from you, Avi, from the list?
No, I don't see anything that
Okay.
that I think we should refer now. I think we will digest the list and then we'll answer it offline.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for Adam for holding this session. Thanks for Chen, Raphael, and Avi for answering questions. And I'd like to, if for some reason you don't have the rest of the series, you can find it at aka.ms/AIP webinar. You can find the recordings at aka.ms/AIP recordings. And if you haven't already, you can join our community at aka.ms security community. At last, I want to thank you for joining us today, and thanks for being part of our community. We hope to see you again next week.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.